Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 2020 Arkansas Monarch and Pollinator Forum's Day 2's afternoon session. I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Timothy Dickson, and he will be discussing a recent study that he did. So, Tim, take it away.
Thank you, everyone, for attending and everyone who watches this afterwards. I'm going to talk today about cattle grazing milkweed, and I want to first of all acknowledge two co-authors, co-workers on this project, Chris Helzer from the Nebraska Nature Conservancy, and Brittany Poinier, a graduate student of mine from the University of Nebraska, Omaha, who collected a lot of the data that I'll initially present. And I also want to give what I consider to be the main take-homes just right here at the start, and you can follow along, see if you agree with me. And so cattle have no problem grazing milkweed. Second of all, cattle appear to graze milkweed throughout the growing season. And third of all, I would argue that we should look for ways to increase milkweed abundance on rangeland. And I'll get to that more later, but in heavily grazed areas, there's not a lot of milkweed, and there could be a lot more, I think. So, I think most people have seen this graphic or something similar. It's looking at monarch abundance over time, in this case, east of the Rocky Mountains. And monarch butterflies have been in decline for a while east of the Rocky Mountains. They're also in decline west of the Rocky Mountains, even though I'm going to be focusing on the eastern side. And this is obviously a big concern because people have a real connection to monarch butterflies, and we don't want to see them go extinct. There's several proposed reasons for why monarch butterflies are in decline. One of them is that there has been a major loss in milkweed due to row crop agriculture and changes in row crop agriculture, specifically more herbicide usage. And there's been enough of a decline in monarch butterflies that they have been considered for listing for protection. I think, as everybody knows, monarch butterfly larvae only feed on milkweeds, and that is a reason why milkweed losses are of concern. If there's not enough milkweeds on the landscape, that limits the ability of monarch larvae to form kind of the next group of monarchs. And since monarchs reproduce several times over each summer, you need to have a fair amount of milkweeds in order for monarch butterflies to keep their numbers up over a growing season and then over multiple years. So there's been an effort by conservation groups to plant over 1 billion stems of milkweed east of the Rocky Mountains, but most of these efforts have ignored rangeland, and I'm going to argue in this presentation that we should be paying attention to rangeland also. One of the main reasons for paying attention to rangeland is there's a lot of it out there. And so in Nebraska, where I'm based out of, 46% of the state is grazed. And if you look at the continental United States as a whole, about 27% of it is grazed. So there's a huge area of the continental United States that's grazed, mostly by cattle. And so what happens there is important. A lot of people assume that cattle do not graze milkweed because they assume it is toxic to cattle. However, when you actually start digging into what people have studied on that, what you quickly find is that there's major differences in the toxicity of different milkweed species, and the species that have been documented to be toxic to cattle are some of the most toxic species. And so, for example, common milkweed has about 1/20 the level of toxic compounds as the species that have been documented to be toxic to cattle. as another, just aside, most of the studies that find milkweed toxicity are when they force feed milkweed to cattle. And so cattle are not the smartest animals on earth, but if left to their own devices, they're generally smart enough to know, don't graze the really toxic milkweed. And so, anyway, I think the idea that cattle never graze milkweed is incorrect. And I would even argue that milkweed is far less of a problem for cattle than most people have thought in the past. So coming to our work, Chris Helzer from the Nebraska Nature Conservancy, he came to us, we were in conversation, and he said, I've noticed that the cattle seem to be grazing milkweed, that they don't seem to be avoiding it. Maybe we should look at that. And we said, yeah, that would be interesting to look at. And so we designed a study to examine how much they are grazing milkweed. So there's just a picture over here on the right. This is where they let cattle into a field in, I believe it was early August. And you can see that these milkweed here have been grazed by cattle. So we said, okay, it appears they're grazing milkweed. How much is that happening? So to look at that, we set up a study in central Nebraska on some Nature Conservancy land. So this is what's called the Platte River Prairies site. And it's right on the Platte River, and this is all Nature Conservancy land. It's primarily restored prairie managed with patch-burn cattle grazing. I'll get into patch-burn cattle grazing in a moment here. So I also want to mention we included ungrazed fields, control fields, just to make sure that if we were seeing milkweed grazing, that we could definitively say, well, it's not just that deer or some other animal is grazing a whole lot of milkweed. And so we had some areas that had cattle grazing and other adjacent areas that did not have cattle grazing. And so in this map, right here, if I can use my mouse, just to walk you through it, the green areas are ungrazed by cattle. And then the white areas, the areas surrounded in white, were grazed by cattle. So cattle, there was a herd that was inside this area that I'm outlining in the center. They could go to any of these areas, but there was an exterior fence basically on this white here so that they were inside that area. One herd was in there, one herd was over here. And then the red denotes the areas that were burned in the spring of 2018. All these areas were managed with burning. So the others had been burned in previous years, but the red areas were burned in the spring of 2018. And then we set up transects. So they were about 200 yards long. And there were 3 transects pretty near to each other. And so these blue lines here are just showing the central transect. And if you're wondering about scale, there is a scale bar, but the easiest way to see it is each of these circles, these center pivots, are a ½ mile in diameter. So that gives you some idea of the scale of this. So we went out to these areas, ungrazed and grazed, to look at how much milkweed was being grazed. Brittany Poinier, from May to September in 2018, she repeatedly sampled the same areas. And so you can see a picture of Brittany over here on the right, and examined how much milkweed were being grazed across the summer. And then also in the middle of the summer, looked at how much big bluestem was being grazed. And so the most common milkweed by far was common milkweed. That's what we looked at. And then big bluestem was the most common grass, most common forage species. And so we focused on that. Stocking density rates were on average 1 cow-calf pair per 10 acres, and they went in April and came off in October. I'm not going to go into the statistics on this. You'll be happy to know, but if you're interested in knowing more about it, email me, talk to me. I would be happy to discuss it. But everything I'm mentioning as a result, statistics have been done on it, and it's been shown to be statistically significant. All right, last thing before getting into the data, I just want to mention, if you are not familiar with patch-burn grazing, it's a method whereby a field is broken up into different patches, different sections, and one patch is burned every year. And so you can see here in this graphic, if this square is a field, this dark green area was burned in the current year. Cattle tend to graze most in the burned areas. It's got lush green grass. And then in year 2, you burn a different area and cattle graze there. They don't graze so much in the previous area. And so cattle can graze anywhere, but they tend to graze most in the spots that have been burned in that year. And so we looked at that as well. We looked at within each of those grazed areas, we looked at areas that had been burned that year and areas that had been burned in previous years. So we expected cattle would graze primarily in the areas that have been burned in that year. We expected the most grass and milkweed grazing there. And then we also expected in ungrazed fields that there would be higher milkweed abundance because there wasn't grazing. Okay, to get to some results, we are presenting the data here as ungrazed in blue, and then the grazed are in the orange and gray. And so orange was burned in previous years, gray was burned in the current year. On the horizontal axis here, we've got dates. So started sampling May 22nd, and then went into June, July, August, and then finished on September 19th. And so basically this is going across the summer of 2018. And then on the vertical axis, this is milkweed stems per acre. So the first thing that jumps out at you is that there's a lot more milkweed in areas that are ungrazed than areas that are grazed. And so by the middle of June, after all the stems had come up and we basically found pretty much all the stems, there were 34 more times more milkweed stems in ungrazed than grazed fields. So there was a lot more milkweed in the ungrazed areas than the grazed areas. And these ungrazed fields were adjacent, so they were essentially identical except for the fact that they were ungrazed. Then I also want to point out that milkweed abundance was low whether the grazed fields had been burned or the grazed patches had been burned that year or in previous years. And so even though they are not exactly on top of each other, there is no greater milkweed abundance in either patch type. So basically, the difference here is just between ungrazed and grazed. That patch burn grazing, those patches did not differ significantly in the milkweed abundance that they had. Okay, then moving on specifically to how much cattle were grazing on milkweeds and the surrounding grass. This here, the dashed lines are showing big blue stem percent grazing. And so the vertical axis now is the percentage of big blue stem stems or common milkweed stems that were grazed. I'll show common milkweed in a minute here. And so big blue stem was not grazed in the ungrazed areas. And as we expected, big blue stem was being grazed more in the patches that were burned that year than in previous years. So cattle were grazing the grass more in areas that were burned in that current year, that green lush grass. If you look at common milkweed, what you find is that throughout the growing season, common milkweed were not really grazed in the ungrazed areas. So deer, other animals were not really grazing common milkweed. But when you got into the grazed areas, they were grazed quite heavily. And so what you can see here is there was steady grazing going up until July. We stopped looking at plants that had died, so that's why there's some kind of moving around of the points out here. But basically by July, cattle had grazed about 80% of the stems of milkweed that were out there. And they were grazing, if anything, more milkweed than the surrounding grass. And so we think that a big part of why patch-burn grazing, why there didn't appear to be differences in the number of milkweeds in the patches that were burned in the current year or previous years, is because even though cattle were spending more time in the patches that were burned that year, they, if anything, were seeking out milkweed and grazing it heavily, even in areas where they weren't spending as much time. And so milkweed was getting hammered in the areas where cattle were spending a lot of time and in the areas where cattle were not spending as much time. All right, so the last bit of data that I want to show, we wanted to make sure that this wasn't something unique to just, this one Nature Conservancy site. And we wanted to do a few other things as well that I won't get into as much. But in 2019, last summer, we did additional sampling and we included a wider swath of Nebraska. And so we had about a 90-mile from west to east area where we looked at grazed and ungrazed fields that were under different management. So we've got some Audubon sites. These are resampled Nature Conservancy sites, Crane Trust for sandhill cranes, so conservation land, and then WPAs are waterfowl production areas. And so basically we had 11 of these sites and we went out and looked again how much are cattle grazing these milkweed. So across these sites, we did measurements. Cattle also came onto some of these sites a bit later, so we were interested in whether they might graze more or less if they came on a little bit later. And the big take-home message, I'm showing this a little bit differently, is that in 2019, if you just graph out the percentage of big bluestem stems that were grazed and the percentage of common milkweed stems that were grazed, it's pretty much the same story. Cattle are grazing milkweed across all these sites when they have a decent amount of cattle grazing on them. And so this dashed line shows what you would expect if cattle were grazing milkweed and big bluestem the same amount. And what you can see is that basically they're not avoiding milkweed. Again, if anything, they're maybe slightly preferentially eating milkweed. I'll also mention 2019, we had a major flood in Nebraska that affected cattle going out a little bit, but whether cattle went on in April, May, or June, they were grazing milkweed quite a lot. So milkweed abundance is much lower in the presence than absence of cattle grazing. We think that is because cattle have no problem grazing milkweed, and that's decreasing milkweed abundance. We also found that while patch-burn grazing may benefit some other wildflower species, it doesn't seem to be benefiting common milkweed, perhaps because cattle are, if anything, seeking out common milkweed. And cattle are grazing common milkweed at least as much as the surrounding grass. And so they're not avoiding it. And it also doesn't seem to be harming them. We never documented any cases where cattle were harmed by eating common milkweed, even though we know they were eating common milkweed. So one positive thing I like to point out about this, there are still people out there that herbicide milkweed species or feel that milkweeds are incompatible with grazed areas. And I think this provides pretty good evidence that cattle don't have a problem with a lot of these milkweed species. And so common milkweed, they ate quite a lot of it with no documented negative effects that we saw. And these other species that I'm showing here on the right, they have not more toxic, these are as toxic compounds or less than common milkweed. And so these milkweed species, they don't appear to be very toxic to cattle. Certainly cattle are not having a problem with them, at the densities we're seeing. And most of these grazed areas, they were maybe, 1% or less of the forage that's out there. And at those densities, cattle weren't having a problem with these milkweed species. So, to herbicide a field, which I know there's some people out there that do, to control common milkweed or these milkweed species that are shown here, I would argue that it's not worth the cost of the herbicide and the time to do it. Cattle don't seem to have a problem with these species. So, so I consider that to be good news. It's something that, I would argue a cattle rancher does not need to worry about. So, as I mentioned before, the cattle that were out there in 2018 and 2019, we documented that they were eating milkweed. Never any indication that they had any problem. They put on weight normally. Never any indication that they had any negative effects due to eating milkweed. All right, so on the flip side, because cattle are regularly eating milkweed, that is almost certainly leading to lower milkweed abundance in some of these grazed areas. And so, we looked at patch-burn and standard uniform management, and those sites pretty uniformly when there was a decent number of cattle out there, they had pretty low milkweed abundance. And so, if anyone out there is thinking, oh, well, rangeland, they've got quite a lot of milkweeds because cattle don't eat milkweed, I would say they are eating plenty of milkweed, and that is almost certainly having an effect on milkweed abundance. And I'd love to talk more about this. It's definitely not, the recent cause of milkweed declines. But again, to go to the positive, or what I would consider to be the positive side, there could be a lot more milkweeds on these grazed fields. And so if there is a way to increase milkweed abundance on these grazed fields, that could be a way to, to kind of bring back milkweeds onto the landscape. And so one thing that, that we're starting to try to look at is to have some areas that maybe don't get grazed until milkweeds have flowered or are ideally seeded, something where they can kind of go through their life cycle, build up some root reserves before they get eaten down every year. And so I'd like to finish by showing this map of the United States, looking at the amount of rangeland, so kind of at a very coarse level. And then I think you can read this as well as me, but you can see cropland in brown, rangeland in yellow, and then some other uses of land. And there's a lot of rangeland east of the Rocky Mountains. There's also a lot west of the Rocky Mountains, but there's enough east of the Rocky Mountains to really move the needle on milkweed abundance. And so if there was a way that these rangeland areas could have higher milkweed abundance, that could really move the needle on total milkweed availability for monarch butterflies in the landscape. And so again, one way to do that, and this is something that I think there needs to be a lot more research on, would be to leave some of these areas through rotational grazing or some other method until milkweeds have had a chance to go through most of their life cycle. But of course, the obvious question of that is, how can you make it pay? I haven't been able to think of something. I think at best, I've been able to think of a way to have that be neutral. And so trying to think of some way to incentivize allowing more milkweed on the landscape is also something that I think we need to think about. So with that, I'd like to thank the Nature Conservancy for funding and use of land, the University of Nebraska, Omaha for funding and support, Nebraska Native Plant Society and the Heartland Bank Scholarship for Brittany Poinier's funding. And then there were a number of organizations that let us use land. And so I'd like to acknowledge Audubon Roe Sanctuary, Crane Trust, Nebraska Waterfowl Production Areas, and then the following people for photographic credits. I'd be happy to take any questions now, or if you send me an email, I'd be happy to answer questions in that way as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was a great presentation. We do have one question. Do you know if antelope horn milkweed has been tested for toxicity levels and where it stands on the gradient? And by antelope horn milkweed, I'm assuming that he means Asclepias viridis.
Yeah. So if I am remembering correctly, and so I'm just going to go back here to bring this up since this relates, it is a little bit more toxic than the 6 that are shown here. Yeah, I wish I could rattle off the statistics on that. I'd be happy if an email gets sent to me, I'd be happy to send the information that I have. There's been a few studies where people look at the cardinalide content, the main toxin, they look at the concentration in different species. And so that's what I'm going off of for toxicity levels. And I believe that viridis or antelope horn is has a higher concentration than the 6 that are listed here. And so then the question would be how much higher, and unfortunately I can't think of that off the top of my head. And so anyway, I'd be happy to send that information. I know that this is where it gets a little bit tricky because it's kind of, okay, but what about this one here? And yeah, I could keep on going off of that, but I can send the information. And I guess the one thing, I'll step out a little bit on a limb here. My remembrance of the studies are viridis and even some more toxic species. Cattle can handle a little tiny bit of it. It's just when they start getting force-fed, pretty large amounts. So, if they're eating like 1% of their body weight or half of 1% of their body weight, you maybe start getting into some problems. But my remembrance is even for things that are a bit more toxic, if there's 1 stem or 2 stems, that, for a lot of these was not something that was as big of a problem. But anyway, I'll be happy to send out that information if somebody wants to email you. I can give you the information I have.
Okay, thank you, Tim. If you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat box. We've probably got time for at least one more question or one from Facebook. There's a little bit of a lag, so I'll give them just a few extra seconds. Tim, I once heard of, someone comparing, cattle eating too much milkweed to make them sick as like a human being drinking too much water. Do you think that would be an appropriate, of course it depends on the species, but do you think that would be an appropriate kind of metaphor?
I would say, looking at this for 2 years, I think milkweed is a lot less toxic than people have been led to believe in the past. It is still a little bit toxic, and so I would say it's different than than water or something completely non-toxic. But I think where you might be going with that is anything can be toxic. If you drink enough water, that can be toxic to you, and so the amount really does matter. And so, so in regards to that, I would say that, most milkweed species, if cattle eat 1 stem of it, it's probably not going to matter. And so, for me, the only place I start to get a bit worried is if there's just a lot of it on a field. And so, if it's, making up more than 1% of forage, and maybe there's a few species that are considered to be, really toxic in there. But at a low concentration, I think for the most part, it is much less of a concern than people have thought in the past.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Tim, for your presentation and all the information that you shared. I have one quick last question. Sorry, just just came in. Do you have any recommendations for approaching conversations with landowners who may be skeptical about including milkweed in a pasture mix?
Yeah, we're working on publishing this, and so once it comes out, you know, I think maybe point them to that, but I think maybe also most of the milkweeds that we found got eaten down pretty quickly, and so in the grazed areas, you know, really none of the milkweeds were going to flower. Once they got big enough, they got grazed down. And so one thing that could be effective is if somebody would let you onto their field in the spring and you could just mark a few of the milkweeds that were coming up in their field and just let them see that, you know, like, hey, I marked them, you know, over here. You know, you can go out and look at them. You know, if you go out a month later, you're going to see that they get grazed down. And, you know, if your cattle aren't having any problems, you know, there's a lot of fields out there that have some milkweed in them. And, you know, if you could show a rancher on their own land that they've got some milkweed and that their cattle are eating them and there doesn't seem to be any effect, that might be a way to, you know, to show, hey, this isn't, you know, a huge deal. But yeah, I know that's a tough conversation because obviously, you know, there's money on the line. And so, you know, people want to be pretty sure about it.
Yeah, great perspective. Thank you so much, Tim. And thank you for being one of our presenters.